There's something about the dark that makes you think twice about what you're doing. I've worked in coal mines for nearly half my life, and every day it's the same. Pitch black tunnels stretching out in front of me, the hum of heavy machinery, and that deep, uneasy silence that settles once the drills go quiet. It's not a job for the faint of heart, but it's what I know. You either learn to live with the darkness or you don't last long down here. My name is Garrett, and I've been running mining equipment for as long as I can remember. These days, I'm part of a crew for Recur Energy Resources, a relatively new company that's still trying to make a name for itself. I run the drills, handle the loaders, and work alongside some of the toughest folks I've ever met. We're in Wyoming, about 500 feet underground in one of Recur's newer mines. The place is cramped, barely wide enough to fit the heavy machines we work with. Edith, who's been with me for years now, says it feels like we're working in a coffin sometimes. She's not wrong. Every time I step into one of those narrow tunnels, I can't help but feel the weight of the earth pressing down on me. But that's just part of the job. Edith's been doing this almost as long as I have, and at 55, she's still one of the hardest workers I know. Then there's Henry, our leader, 60 years old and tough as nails, though these days he's starting to show signs of wear. The newer guys, Connor and Owen, are younger and greener, but eager enough to prove themselves. We all share a common respect for the mine, but there's always a hint of unease in the air, especially on days like today. It started out like any other day. I was operating the drill, breaking through the rock as the rest of the crew worked behind me, loading debris into the carts. The dust hung thick in the air, the kind that clogs your lungs if you're not careful. We had a job to do, and as always, we fell into the rhythm of it. Drill, load, haul, repeat. It was monotonous, sure, but the kind of work where you could let your mind drift just enough to keep from going crazy. Then, around mid-morning, Henry got a call over the comms. The higher-ups wanted us to head deeper into the mine. There was a new section they wanted to explore, and they figured we were the right crew for the job. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little excited. After weeks of doing the same thing, day in and day out, the thought of breaking into new ground had a certain appeal. Edith and I talked about it over lunch, sitting on a couple of overturned crates just outside the main tunnel. Could be interesting, she said, wiping the sweat from her brow. Or it could be a disaster. You know how these things go. I nodded, but there was something in the air that day, a sort of tension I couldn't shake. Maybe it was the silence from the others, or the way Henry seemed more on edge than usual. By the time we started packing up our gear to head into the new section, that feeling had settled into the pit of my stomach. The tunnel leading deeper into the mine was narrower than usual, barely wide enough for us to squeeze the equipment through. The lights were flickering, too, just another thing to add to the growing list of things that felt off. But it wasn't until Edith stopped dead in her tracks, staring at the wall ahead of us, that I realized something was seriously wrong. "What the hell is that?" she muttered, pointing to a section of the rock face. I stepped closer, squinting in the dim light, and saw it, rebar. Thick steel bars embedded in the rock, like something you'd see in a city construction site. But we were 500 feet underground, in a coal mine. There shouldn't have been anything man-made down here, not this deep. Henry came over, his face pale as he ran his hand along the rebar. "This isn't right," he muttered. "This shouldn't be here." He radioed up to the surface, explaining what we'd found, but all we got in response was static. The comms were acting up again, another thing to chalk up to the isolation of working so far below ground. But instead of calling it a day, the higher-ups told us to keep going. They wanted us to blast through, see what was on the other side. So that's what we did. Edith set the charges, and we all stepped back as the explosion echoed through the tunnel, sending dust and debris flying. When the smoke cleared, what lay beyond wasn't what any of us expected. We'd broken through into a massive cavern, far larger than any part of the mine we'd worked in before. And there, in the middle of the cavern, was something even stranger, An underground warehouse, its walls covered in thick dust, crates stacked haphazardly along the sides. It looked like it had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. For a moment, none of us spoke. We just stood there, staring at the structure that had no business being this deep underground. "What the hell is this place?" Connor whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the equipment. Henry didn't have an answer. None of us did. All we knew was that we'd stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to find. As we moved closer to the warehouse, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't just the size of the place, or the way the dust seemed to hang in the air like it hadn't been disturbed in years. It was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I glanced at Edith, who was staring at the structure with the same uneasy expression. Whatever this place was, it wasn't right. The warehouse stretched out before us, massive and looming in the dim light from our helmets. I couldn't help but feel like we had no business being there. It wasn't just the size of the place. It was the stillness. The thick layer of dust covering everything told me no one had been down here in years, maybe longer. We were intruding on something ancient, forgotten. And that never ends well. As we moved deeper into the structure, the temperature seemed to drop. I could see my breath fogging up in front of me, each exhale hanging in the air a little too long. The whole crew was quiet, the usual chatter gone. Henry kept glancing back at me, his eyes full of unspoken questions. Connor was the first to break the silence. "What is this place?" he muttered, mostly to himself. None of us had an answer, but the unease was growing. Edith, usually the most unflappable of the bunch, was unusually tense, her hand never leaving the handle of the heavy flashlight she carried like a weapon. The deeper we went, the stranger things got. The layout of the warehouse didn't make sense. Doors led to nowhere, corridors looped back on themselves, and every room seemed wrong, somehow. There was a mess hall, complete with tables and chairs still in place, like the workers had just stepped out for a smoke break and never came back. But the food was long gone, and everything was covered in that thick layer of dust, undisturbed for God knows how long. And the sound, there was this faint, constant hum in the air, like machinery running far off in the distance, even though the place was clearly abandoned. It was Connor who first noticed the eyes. We were just about to check one of the larger rooms when he froze, his face turning pale in the glow of his headlamp. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely a breath. I followed his gaze into the dark corner of the room, but all I could see was blackness. "What did you see?" I asked, my voice louder than I intended. He didn't answer, just pointed. I squinted, trying to make out what had spooked him. And then I saw it, a pair of small, reflective eyes staring back at me from the shadows. For a second, I couldn't move. The eyes were low to the ground, almost like they belonged to an animal, but we were 500 feet underground. What the hell kind of animal could survive down here? Before I could react, the eyes blinked and disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a sinking feeling in my gut. "We need to get out of here," Connor muttered, his voice shaking. Edith nodded in agreement, and for the first time, Henry looked like he wasn't sure what to do. He opened his mouth to say something, but the words never came. That's when we heard it, a low, scraping sound, like something sharp dragging along the concrete floor. It echoed through the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. We all turned toward the source, but there was nothing there, just the thick darkness pressing in from all sides. The sound came again, closer this time. I felt my heart pound in my chest, every instinct telling me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. Owen, always the brave one, decided to act. "I'm gonna check it out," he said, his voice steady despite the fear I could see in his eyes. Before anyone could stop him, he stepped forward into the darkness, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. We watched as his light bobbed down the hallway, the beam shrinking as he moved further away. And then, just like that, the light flickered once and went out. The silence that followed was unbearable. None of us dared to move. "Owen?" Edith called out, her voice trembling for the first time since I'd known her. There was no response, just the sound of our breathing and the distant hum that seemed to grow louder. Then, without warning, a scream tore through the air, loud, raw, and full of terror. It was Owen. I've heard men scream before. In this line of work, accidents happen. But this was different. This wasn't a cry of pain. It was pure, unfiltered fear. And it was cut short, too short, like something had silenced him. We all stood frozen, staring into the blackness where his light had disappeared, waiting for him to come running back. But he didn't. "Jesus Christ," Brody muttered under his breath. "What the hell is happening?" No one had an answer. Henry, always the one to keep us together, was visibly shaken. "We need to go after him," Connor said, but his voice lacked any conviction. Edith shook her head. "We don't know what's out there," she said. "We need to get the hell out of here." Before we could make a decision, there was another noise. This one wasn't a scrape. It was a heavy, wet thud, like something being dragged. And it was coming toward us. Fast. Henry grabbed his flashlight and motioned for us to move. "We need to get back to the vehicles," he said, his voice tight with panic. Now. We turned and ran. I don't remember much about those next few minutes, just the sound of our boots pounding against the concrete, the flickering lights barely illuminating the path back to the tunnel. Whatever was in the warehouse wasn't far behind us. I could hear it, scraping, dragging, and every now and then, the sound of something breathing, heavy and ragged, like it was hunting us. When we finally made it back to the tunnel, Brody collapsed against the wall, clutching his leg. He must have twisted his ankle during the sprint, but there was no time to check. Henry radioed to the surface, but all we got was static. Connor tried to calm Brody down, but nothing was going to make this situation better. Edith and I stood at the mouth of the tunnel, staring into the blackness of the warehouse, knowing that Owen wasn't coming back. That's when we saw them again, those eyes, just beyond the reach of our lights. Dozens of them, reflecting back at us, watching, waiting. We stood there, breathless, staring into the blackness where those eyes watched us. They weren't just close. They were all around, blinking in and out like fireflies, reflecting back at us in the faint beam of our flashlights. Something had been down here with us the whole time, hiding, waiting. Owen was gone, and I think we all knew then that we were next if we didn't act fast. Brody was still slumped against the tunnel wall, clutching his leg in pain. Edith knelt beside him, trying to get him to his feet, but he winced and shook his head. "I can't move," he muttered, his voice strained. The fear in his eyes was the same as in the rest of us, but his body wasn't cooperating. "Just leave me," he said. "I'll slow you down." There was no way we were doing that, though. We weren't the kind of crew that left people behind, no matter how bad things got. But I could see the panic spreading like wildfire through all of us. Henry, who'd always been our rock, was barely holding it together. He stood there with his flashlight shaking in his hand, the beam dancing across the walls. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice shaky but firm. "We'll figure something out for Brody, but we can't stay here. We need to get to the rescue chamber." He was right. Staying here, so close to that warehouse, wasn't an option, but the idea of dragging Brody through those tunnels, knowing what was watching us, didn't feel much better. Edith took charge, the way she always did when things got bad. "Connor, help me get Brody up," she ordered. Connor didn't argue. He grabbed Brody's arm, and together they managed to hoist him to his feet. Brody gritted his teeth, doing his best to put weight on his injured leg, but it was clear he wouldn't be able to go far. We didn't have much time. The sound of scratching started up again, louder this time, echoing off the tunnel walls. Whatever was out there, it was moving, closing in on us. "Go," Brody gasped. "I'll slow them down." His voice was full of fear, but there was something else there too, determination. He wasn't ready to give up, but he knew we couldn't stay with him. I wanted to argue, to tell him we'd find a way, but deep down, I knew he was right. Henry cursed under his breath, pacing in place as if he could shake off the impossible decision that lay in front of us. "We'll come back for you," Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper, but even as he said it, I could see in his eyes that he didn't believe it. We started moving down the tunnel, dragging Brody between us. Every step felt like it took years, and every sound seemed to echo in ways that didn't make sense. The scratching grew louder, closer. There were more of them now, the eyes multiplying in the darkness. The tunnel lights flickered as we moved, like they were being toyed with. It felt like the mine itself was turning against us, the walls closing in, suffocating. As we rounded a corner, I looked back, just for a second. What I saw made my blood freeze. Brody had fallen to the ground, clutching his flashlight in one hand, trying to crawl away. Behind him, the creatures finally stepped out of the shadows. They were massive, their hunched forms barely visible in the flickering light. But the eyes, those eyes, they glowed, too many of them, all focused on Brody. Before I could yell, before I could do anything, they swarmed him, their dark shapes blotting out the light entirely. His scream pierced the air, cutting right through me like a knife. And then, silence. Complete and utter silence. We kept running. There was no time to process what had just happened, no time to grieve. We had to keep moving, and fast. But the further we went, the worse things got. The lights along the tunnel were flickering more now, barely staying on for longer than a few seconds. The air felt thick, heavy, like the mine was breathing right alongside us. Every now and then, we'd catch glimpses of those eyes, always just out of reach, watching, waiting. Henry stopped us at the next junction. His breathing was ragged, his face pale. "We're almost to the rescue chamber," he said, pointing down the narrow tunnel to our right. "If we can make it there, we can lock ourselves in and wait for help." He didn't sound confident, and I didn't feel confident either, but it was the only plan we had. Edith nodded, grim determination in her eyes. We had no choice but to keep going. The tunnel to the rescue chamber was even narrower, barely wide enough for us to squeeze through with our gear. The walls pressed in on either side, and I could feel the rough stone brushing against my shoulders as we hurried forward. Every step felt like it took an eternity, and behind us, the scraping sounds were getting closer, faster. They were coming. By the time we reached the chamber, Connor was practically dragging Henry, who had started limping from sheer exhaustion. Edith punched in the code to open the chamber door, her fingers shaking. The door creaked open, and we all piled inside, slamming it shut behind us. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to breathe. The chamber was small, barely big enough for the four of us. The air inside was cold, stale, but it felt like a sanctuary compared to the tunnel outside. We were safe, or so we thought. The creatures couldn't get in here. At least, that's what we told ourselves. The chamber was designed to withstand cave-ins, built solidly enough to protect us from the natural dangers of the mine. But as we stood there, catching our breath, the walls seemed to close in even tighter. The only light came from the flickering emergency bulb in the ceiling, casting long, eerie shadows across the room. Then, the scratching started again. The air in the rescue chamber was thick with tension, the kind that settles deep in your chest and refuses to let go. We had barely made it inside, and now that the door was sealed, there was no going back. We stood there, listening, waiting. It was Henry who spoke first, his voice a rough whisper in the dark. "We're safe here. It can't get in." But none of us believed him. Not really. The scratching started almost immediately, faint at first, like something testing the walls. The sound grew louder with each passing minute. It was coming from just outside the door, claws scraping against the thick metal. The creatures were there, just beyond the threshold, and they knew we were inside. Every time the noise stopped, we'd hold our breath, hoping it was over, only for it to begin again, closer, more frantic. It was like they were trying to find a weakness, any crack in the walls that would let them in. Edith sat against the far wall, her eyes closed, breathing slowly like she was trying to calm herself down. Connor paced the small space, his flashlight swinging in erratic arcs as the bulb above us flickered. His muttering filled the silence. This wasn't supposed to happen. We were just supposed to clear the mine. We were supposed to. It wasn't supposed to be like this. His words didn't make sense, but I knew what he meant. None of this made sense. What had we found down here? Why had we even been sent into that part of the mine? The deeper we got, the more it felt like a trap, like we had been lured down here to wake something up. Henry was the only one who hadn't moved since we locked the door. He was staring at the wall, barely blinking, his face pale and drawn. He looked older than I had ever seen him, the weight of everything we had been through pressing down on him. I wanted to say something, anything, to bring him back to us, but I didn't have the words. None of us did. We were trapped in the silence, the scratching our only companion. And then the lights went out. For a moment, none of us moved. We were plunged into total darkness, the kind you can feel pressing against your skin. My heart raced, every beat louder than the last, and I could hear Edith sucking in sharp breaths beside me. Connor's flashlight flicked on, casting long shadows on the walls, but the beam wasn't strong enough to cut through the thick blackness that seemed to surround us. "Damn it," Henry muttered under his breath. "They've cut the power." It made sense. Whatever those things were, they knew we were here, and they were toying with us. They couldn't get in, but they could make us suffer. I gripped the edge of the bench I was sitting on, my knuckles turning white. This wasn't just a waiting game anymore. It was a siege. "What are we gonna do?" Connor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He was looking at Henry, waiting for him to give orders, but Henry wasn't saying a word. He just sat there, lost in his own thoughts. Edith was the one who finally spoke. "We wait," she said. "We stay calm, and we wait." Her voice was steady, but I could hear the fear in it. She wasn't as calm as she wanted to be. The scratching outside continued, relentless, but now it was joined by something else. A faint tapping sound, like fingers drumming against the door. It was soft, almost gentle, but it sent a shiver down my spine. The creatures were mocking us, letting us know they were still there, waiting for us to make a mistake. Time passed slowly in that chamber. Minutes felt like hours, and the tapping and scratching never stopped. I don't know how long we sat there, listening to the sounds of our own doom. I kept looking at the door, half expecting it to burst open at any moment, but it held firm. Our only comfort was that the rescue chamber was built to withstand cave-ins, but it wasn't meant for this kind of thing. It wasn't meant to keep out whatever was lurking on the other side. Henry finally broke his silence. "They're not gonna come for us," he said, his voice flat. "We've lost comms. The power's gone, and we're too deep. They'll assume we didn't make it." His words hung in the air like a death sentence. It was true. Without communication, there was no way for the surface crew to know we were still alive. For all they knew, we were already dead. "We can't just sit here," Connor said, desperation creeping into his voice. "We need to try and make a run for it, back to the surface." His flashlight was shaking in his hand, and I could tell he was on the verge of breaking down. Edith shook her head. "We wouldn't make it 10 feet. You saw what happened to Brody. They'd pick us off before we even got close." It was the truth, but it was hard to hear. I wanted to believe there was a way out, but every instinct told me we were trapped. The creatures outside were patient. They weren't in a hurry, and they knew we couldn't stay in here forever. The scratching stopped. For a moment, we sat in silence, all of us holding our breath. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the noise. It felt like the calm before the storm, the kind of quiet that makes you brace yourself for what's coming next. "Maybe they're gone," Connor whispered, but even he didn't believe it. Then, from somewhere deep in the mine, we heard a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It was a long, low howl, a noise that echoed through the tunnels and reverberated through the chamber. Whatever was out there wasn't gone. It was just waiting.